Hey guys, Dr. G here. If you are into intermittent fasting as I am, you are going to want to hear about this new abstract from today from the American Heart Association meeting. So intermittent fasting is when you go through sustained periods of time with little or no calorie consumption. Most people do this with what's called daily time restricted eating. So they restrict all their calories to a short number of hours in the day. A very common regimen is 16-8, so 16 hours of fasting and then 8 hours of eating every day. You can go down to 6 or even 4 sometimes, but 16-8 is very common. We have lots of studies, hundreds of studies, looking at the effects of intermittent fasting. So when you're doing that fast, what's happening is that you're switching from carbs to ketones as the main source of energy for your cells. When you do that, what's called that metabolic switch, a lot of good things happen on a metabolic level according to studies. You have an improvement in your glucose metabolism. You have a reduction in inflammatory markers, markers of inflammation in your body, reduction in stress markers, markers of stress in your body. Then you have randomized controlled trials where they randomly assign people to intermittent fasting or normal eating pattern with the same number of calories in both groups. And it shows that if you consume those calories with an intermittent fasting pattern, a lot of other good things happen. Your insulin sensitivity improves. Your sugar levels actually go down in diabetics. In diabetics and non-diabetics, there's evidence from some studies that cholesterol gets better, waist circumference goes down, weight goes down, even in some studies, blood pressure goes down. So all things that you would expect to improve your cardiovascular outcomes. And that's why this study is so surprising. So it's just an abstract for now, but what we're hearing from this abstract is that people who reported intermittent fasting had a 91% higher risk of dying of a cardiovascular event compared to people who had a more normal eating pattern. So it's the opposite of pretty much what the entire body of evidence up to now has suggested, with the caveat that we haven't had long-term studies because you can't really randomize someone to a diet and ask them to stay on that diet for years as part of a study, and you won't know about cardiovascular outcomes for several years after these risk factors are changed. So this is a survey study. It's an observational study where they had about 20,000 people over about 15 years. The average person answered this survey for 8 years, and they asked them about their eating habits. They asked them about their cardiovascular outcomes, and people who reported having a 16-8 pattern had this increased risk of cardiovascular death. Now, a lot of caveats with this. This is a recall study. People aren't good at remembering their diet and their eating patterns. They also asked about eating patterns over only a few days. They're not asking about sustained intermittent fasting over months or even years. We don't know if these people actually did that. We also don't know about confounders, and this is probably the most important thing, is it could be that the people doing the intermittent fasting were doing it because they were overweight or because they had diabetes or high cholesterol. So it could be that the cardiovascular risk factor was actually the indication for them doing this diet, and that's the reason they had a higher chance of cardiovascular death, having nothing to do, in fact, with the intermittent fasting. So we are going to want to see the full study, see if they measured those other things, even basic things like how these groups compare on the different sexes, ages within the group, who had diabetes, who didn't, etc., etc. So really surprising result. It gives me pause. I want to see the full study. I want to see if this is real. I want to see more studies like it, large studies, because up to now what we've had is very robust evidence by this point, many studies suggesting that over the short term at least, there are metabolic benefits with intermittent fasting that would suggest good cardiovascular outcomes. But we don't know that for sure. We don't have long-term studies showing those good cardiovascular outcomes. So we have to be open to the possibility that something bad could be happening long-term. So I'm not changing anything for now. Hit me up in the comments if you are. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this if you're doing intermittent fasting. But we need to see more studies, and we definitely need to see the full study for this abstract in particular. But lots to think about.